Welcome to Marx 1113. I am Bernard Harcourt, and this is the full-length introduction to the seminar Marx 1113 with Kohei Saito on the late Marx. In this session, we skip forward to the late or the final Marx, and we welcome Kohei Saito from the University of Tokyo to discuss his own manifesto on Degrowth Communism, titled Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto. In terms of our year-long seminar, we are effectively jumping over what would constitute the next historical episode, the creation of the International Workingmen's Association in 1864, which lasted till 1876, generally referred to as the First International, or the IWA, the rise and fall of the Paris Commune in March through May 1871, Marx's addresses to the First International and the situation in Paris, and his famous essay, The Civil War in France, read to the General Council of the IWA just a few days after the collapse of the Paris Commune. We will return to this penultimate historical episode at our next session, Marx 1213, with Bruno Bostiels on April 23, 2025. But for today, we put that penultimate period aside and focus on the late Marx with Kohei Saito. And we will return to the late Marx as well in our closing session of Marx 1313 with Etienne Balibar on May 27th in Paris. The late Marx is of particular importance to a scholar like Kohei Saito because it is during his final years that Marx expands his repertoire to engage a wide range of areas outside of the classic corpus of political economy that he had focused on from the 1840s to the 1860s. In his final years, Marx explores scholarship in chemistry and the natural sciences on the effects of advanced agricultural technologies and practices on the ecosystem. He reads works on the history of political development in India, Russia, and Algeria. Marx consults the work of anthropologists on pre-capitalist societies. He explores work on land use and actual practices in ancient Rome, in South America, and among the indigenous peoples in America. He reads the anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan and takes copious notes in what has come to be known as his ethnological notebooks. He annotates the work of the natural scientist Justus von Liebig in the field of agricultural chemistry, and Liebig's book, Organic Chemistry and its Application to Agriculture and Physiology from 1840. He reads and annotates the agriculturalist Karl Marx's book on climate and plant life through the ages. He reads the work of the German legal historian George Ludwig von Maher on the history of the early village institutions among the Germanic peoples and the questions of communal property. He explores the climate and agriculture of ancient Greece, of Egypt, of the Mesopotamia. He reads the studies of William Stanley Jevon's warning of the shrinking deposits of easily accessible coal in England, and all of his copious notes and writings are collected and now being collected in the Mega 2 edition of his complete works. During the period, Marx publishes far less than he had in earlier decades. His manuscript notebooks fill volumes of the new Mega 2 edition of his and Engels' collected works, but practically none of it had been published. The most important writings from these final years, especially for scholars of the late Marx, include the following, listed in order of importance rather than chronology. First, the multiple drafts and the final letter that Marx wrote to the Russian revolutionary Vera Zasulich in February and March 1881. Second, the preface to the second Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels published in 1882. Third, the critique of the Gotha program that Marx published a few years earlier in 1875. And then, of course, the ethnological notebooks that I mentioned that he kept during his readings and his study. These texts form the backbone of the late Marx that Kohei Saito analyzes in his work, Slow Down, and also in his earlier books, including Marx's Eco-Socialism, Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy, which was published in 2017. Now, in this focus on the late Marx, Saito is not alone, but he forms part of a burgeoning research cluster of Marx scholars who have unearthed a late Marx, or the last Marx, le dernier Marx. The effort traces back at least to the 1970s with the work of scholars such as Wada Haruki in Japan, who was the author of Marx, Engels, and Revolutionary Russia in 1975, and the publication in 1972 of Marx's ethnological notebooks. Today, scholars working on the late Marx include Marcelo Musto, the author of the 2016 book, The Last Years of Karl Marx, an intellectual biography, Theodor Shanin, and the contributors to the late Marx and the Russian Road, Marx and the Peripheries of Capitalism, a similar edition of the late Marx in French by Koja Lindner and the scholars who published the collected edition of Le Dernier Marx at Asymmetrie in 2019. Michael Lowy, Pier Paolo Poggio, Maximilien Rubel, authors of Le Dernier Marx, Communisme en Devenir, 2018, and others, of course. And importantly, today, Kohei Saito, author of Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto, and of an earlier books as well on the late Marx. Now, what is unique, though, about Kohei Saito's work is that he marries the late Marx with an argument for degrowth communism. While others have wedded the late Marx to ecological aspirations and to eco-socialism, Saito goes further and argues for degrowth. Saito's advocacy of degrowth communism includes, at its heart, an argument for worker cooperatives, consumer co-ops, and mutual aid. It embraces the ambition of an economic regime of mutually reinforcing cooperative enterprises, or what I call cooperism. In fact, that is how Saito starts the English edition of his book, Slow Down. Saito opens the preface to the English edition with an anecdote about a time that he was presenting a public lecture in Suzuka City, the home of Honda's principal car factory and also of the Suzuka Circuit, which is the Japanese equivalent of the United States Grand Prix. After his talk, he was approached by a man who had come all the way from Tokyo, a 3-hour ride, who told him about his dilemma and asked for advice. The man owned a rubber plant and had come to realize the ecological damage that the plant was doing. Saito responded to the man that he should convert his company into a worker cooperative. Saito wrote, "My answer was that he should sign his business over to his employees. Since capitalism is the ultimate cause of climate breakdown, it is necessary to transition to a steady-state economy. All companies, therefore, need to become cooperatives or cease trading." Saito's position there dovetails perfectly with the argument for cooperation and cooperatives, or what I call cooperism in the book, Cooperation. Understood, right, as a network of cooperatives, mutuals, unions, credit unions, and mutual aid forms. And Saito traces a similar argument in the late Marx, in Marx's support for communal forms of ownership among the Russian agricultural workers. It is where he ends the book as well, on a call for action that includes worker cooperatives, organic farms, democratization of production, and mutual aid networks. These are signature strategies of cooperism. Now, in this full-length introduction, I will introduce the late Marx and then turn to Kohei Saito's formative interpretation and argument for degrowth communism. So a few words on the late Marx. When we say the late Marx, we generally refer loosely to the final decade of Marx's life, from 1873 about to 1883, or sometimes even to just the final years of his life, 1881 to 1883. Basically, the period following the publication of Capital in 1867, following the turmoil of the Paris Commune in 1871, and following the close of the First International around 1876. During these last years, Marx is reading and taking copious notes on a range of problematics beyond Western European industrialization and beyond the German, French, and British working class. In the process, he produces a small set of critical writings. Let me go over those in their order of importance. The first consists of the several drafts and the final written reply to Vera Zasulich in February and March of 1881. Vera Zasulich was a Russian revolutionary who was living at the time, in 1881, in exile in Geneva, Switzerland, after her assassination attempt and subsequent acquittal at trial of the police chief of St. Petersburg. A supporter of the Russian form of communal agricultural property known as Obshchina, Zasulich wrote to Marx asking him whether he could imagine a path to communism that passed through communal ownership and bypassed Western-style industrialization. Now, a quick word on the Obshchina, also referred to in the literature as the Mir in Russia. The Obshchina was a form of communal land ownership in Russia, by means of which the agricultural workers, who are always referred to as the peasants, decided in common how to distribute commonly held land among different households, what crops to plant, and how to rotate land usage. It amounted loosely to a kind of commune, or agricultural worker cooperative. It is believed that the Obshchina had its origins in the early 1500s, if not before, and so essentially predated feudalism in Russia. This form of communal land ownership eventually became the core of rural Soviets after the Russian Revolution, and for the most part, the Obshchinas would be dissolved as a result of forced collectivization under Stalin. Now, Zasulich wrote a letter to Marx dated February 16, 1881, posing a question that she described as, in her words, a matter of life or death, especially for our socialist party. She and her comrades, socialist comrades, Marxist comrades, had been fighting over the application of Marx's work, Capital, to the political situation in Russia. The question was whether the rural commune in Russia, the Obshchina, was capable of developing into socialism, in which case the socialist revolutionary had to sacrifice everything to the development of these communes, or whether, on the other hand, Russia would have to go through the lengthy and grueling process of industrialization, as Western Europe had. Zasulich recounts her disagreements with her comrades, and the fact that those who argued that Russia had to go through a form of industrialization first explicitly relied on Marx's Capital. They said that that's what he had said in Capital. But she asks him whether that's really true, right? And of course, she's taking the position that it would be a lot better for the course of history, for Russian history, for the people of Russia, if they didn't go through the forms of exploitative industrialization that led to the misery of the proletarian working class, but if they could accede to a socialist horizon on the basis of the communal property regimes that they were having on the communes and the worker cooperatives. Zasulich's letter prompted a deep reconsideration by Marx of his views about possible paths to communism. Marx penned a number of drafts of a response to Zasulich, ultimately cutting down the size of his letter. In early drafts, Marx suggested that the rural communes would lead to a rejuvenation of Russian society and help create a post-capitalist society superior to those societies that experienced the domination of capitalism. Marx struggled with these drafts and penned 4 drafts before reaching his final reply. The first draft, well, there's some dispute as to which was first and which was second. Traditionally, what's called the first draft was 4,500 words long. What's usually called the second draft was pared down to 2,000 words. The third draft was 2,000 words. The fourth draft was only 300 words. And then finally, the reply that he writes to Zasulich is short. It's 350 words. The final letter Marx sends is dated March 8th, 1881. And after apologizing for his delay, Marx begins with 2 citations from his work, Capital. 2 citations intended to emphasize that his book, Capital, was only addressing the situation of industrialized Western European economies. The first passage of Capital that he quotes is the section concerning, in his words, the analysis of the genesis of capitalist production. The passage from Capital is the following. At the heart of the capitalist system is a complete separation of the producer from the means of production. The expropriation of the agricultural producer is the basis of the whole process. Only in England has it been accomplished in a radical manner. But all the other countries of Western Europe are following the same course. And he cites here to the French edition of Capital at page 315. He's writing the letter in French as well, since the correspondence was in French with Zasulich. Marx thus emphasizes here that he was only analyzing Western Europe. He underscores this. He writes, quote, the, quote, historical inevitability, unquote, of this course is therefore expressly restricted to the countries of Western Europe, he writes. And he then writes that the reason for this restriction is indicated in chapter 32 of Capital, which he then again quotes for Zasulich. And this is the second passage. The following passage. Private property, founded upon personal labor, is supplanted by capitalist private property, which rests on exploitation of the labor of others, on wage labor. And there he's citing to Capital, the French edition, at page 340. Marx then concludes with a single paragraph that has received now lengthy treatment. And what he writes reads as follows, with his own emphases. In the Western case, then, one form of private property is transformed into another form of private property. In the case of the Russian peasantry, however, their communal property would have to be transformed into private property. The analysis in Capital, therefore, provides no reasons either for or against the vitality of the Russian commune. But the special study I have made of it, including a search for original source material, has convinced me that the commune is the fulcrum for social regeneration in Russia. But in order that it might function as such, the harmful influences assailing it on all sides must first be eliminated, and it must then be assured the normal conditions for spontaneous development. So in effect, Marx argues that capital doesn't determine the question, but that he has done his own new research since capital in those final years. And on the basis of that research, he believes that the communal property regimes in Russia can serve as the basis for revolutionary change. They can serve, but of course, as long as they push aside, right, harmful influences assailing it on all sides. Okay, and we'll come back to this passage. The second key passage of the late Marx is the 1882 preface to the Communist Manifesto. Now, this is the Russian preface to the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels penned and published in January of 1882. It's referred to as the preface to the second Russian edition of the Manifesto of the Communist Party. That preface, as well, specifically addresses the question of a Russian revolution and the potential role of the община as a way to bypass industrialization. The passage is relatively short. The preface itself is very short, and so I'll read the two key paragraphs. Marx and Engels write, "In Russia we find, face to face with the rapidly flowering capitalist swindle and bourgeois property, just beginning to develop, more than half the land owned in common by the peasants. Now the question is, can the Russian община, though greatly undermined, yet formed of primeval common ownership of land, pass directly to the higher form of communist common ownership? Or, on the contrary, must it first pass through the same process of dissolution, such as constitutes the historical evolution of the West? The only answer to that possible today is this. If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development." All right, I butchered that last paragraph, so let me just repeat it. The only answer to that possible today is this. If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as a starting point for a communist development. So you hear here as well that Marx embraces the idea of communal property as a foundation for revolutionary change. The third text is an earlier text, 7 years earlier. It's the critique of the Gotha program. And in that text, Marx famously responds to the Gotha program, which was a draft platform for the proposed unification of two workers' parties, the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany and the General German Workers' Association, the latter which was formed by the German socialist politician Ferdinand Lassalle. The platform was itself associated with Lassalle, who was an acquaintance of Marx from the time of the 1848 and 1849 revolutions in Germany. In the critique of the Gotha program, published in 1875, Marx disparages the Lassallean platform. He criticizes the words and the terms that are used, particularly the language of the draft platform for its use of the terms equal rights and fair distribution. Marx argues that the reliance on the concept of equal rights throughout the text privileges legal relations over economic relations, and that this inverts the relationship between law and economics. This is, of course, the relationship between the infrastructure and the superstructure. This echoes Marx's argument that law is superstructural or ideological, an argument that we find in the Brussels manuscripts of 1845, known as the German ideology, and in the 1859 preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy. Marx asks, rhetorically, quote, "Are economic relations regulated by legal conceptions, or do not, on the contrary, legal relations arise from economic ones?" Marx characterizes the notion of equal rights as nothing more than a bourgeois notion, arguing that it is simply a bourgeois right in the absence of an equal labor force. Marx goes on to argue there that the use of rights language does not appreciate the historical dimension of societal transformation. It does not recognize that there are phases of revolutionary change. In a first phase of communism, Marx argues, there may well be some reliance on the defective notion of equal right, because many of the new institutions will still be, in his words, stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb they emerge. However, Marx believes that in a later, or in a what he calls higher phase of communist society, there will develop a better understanding of real equality based on abilities and needs. In a fully communist society, there will not be a question of equal rights. Instead, society will be governed by the principle, quote, "from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." These are, of course, the famous words of the Critique of the Growth Program, where Marx writes, "In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." Now, the section from this classic passage that interests Kohei Saito as a scholar of the late Marx is specifically the clause, quote, "after all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly." For Saito, Marx's use of the term cooperative wealth here indexes communal property and communal wealth. He writes, quote, "It seems quite natural to thus read the sentence as referring to the cooperative management of wealth as understood as communal," Saito writes. He then asks whether the passage suggests, for Marx, that, quote, "societal cooperation fostered by communism is modeled on the management of communal wealth in the communal social organization of ancient Germanic peoples, and as such should be reinstated in Western Europe as well." Now, Saito phrases this as a rhetorical question, but it's clear that for him the answer is yes. And this is, of course, the import, then, of the Critique of the Gotha program. The idea that communal wealth, wealth created by commonly held property, right, is what is going to lead us forward and should be reinstated in Western Europe as well. Okay, the fourth text that is often discussed are the ethnological notebooks. Now, these are handwritten manuscripts, notebooks, that Marx filled while he was reading the anthropological writings of Lewis Henry Morgan, specifically his book Ancient Society, when he was reading John Bud Fear's The Aryan Village, when he was reading Henry Summer Maine's Lectures on the Early History of Institutions, when he was reading John Lubbock's The Origin of Civilization. Marx's unpublished notes and annotations, his excerpts and commentaries were written during the period 1880 to 1882, and these were compiled by Lawrence Crater and published really for the first time as a standalone book or set of manuscripts in 1972. They contain Marx's last thoughts and comments about primitive accumulation, about the formation of the state, and about the conception of human beings nested within social relations. So, what is this Marx of the late Marx? I would suggest that read through the lens of scholars such as Kohei Saito, Marcello Musto, Theodore Chanin, Kolja Lindner, Michael Lowy, Pier Paolo Poggio, Maximilian Rubel, and others, read through the lens of the scholars of the late Marx, these final writings constitute a very different Marx than the one that we are accustomed to, especially accustomed to from the mature economic writings of Capital, Volume 1. The traditional Marx, we know, is a productivist, economistic Marx, who both critiqued but also praised capitalism for making possible forms of abundance and technological advancement that alone made possible the advent of communism. On this conventional reading, capitalism was the condition of possibility of communism. Now, this is based not only on a reading of Capital, but also in part on reading the Communist Manifesto. Kohei Saito summarizes the traditional view of Marx in the following terms. He writes, "The advance of capitalism involves the extreme exploitation of workers by capitalists, widening the gap between the rich and the poor. Capitalists compete against each other, raising their productivity, which leads to the production of more and more commodities. But workers, exploited due to low wages, can't afford to buy those commodities. This eventually leads to a crisis of overproduction. The already exploited workers thus suffer another blow, this time due to the unemployment stemming from this crisis, and rise up en masse, bringing about a socialist revolution. The capitalists are purged, the workers freed." Now, that's Saito writing. That is the traditional reading of Marx. And of course, it is a traditional reading that was subject to several critiques, including its excessive focus on European industrialization, its valorization of productivism despite the imperialist tendencies of capitalism, and its apparent incompatibility with environmentalism, among other things. The scholars of late Marx, however, propose a dramatically different Marx. I would call it, perhaps without the negative connotation, a revisionist Marx. It is revisionist because, along at least 6 dimensions, it offers an entirely different reading of Marx, one that absolves Marx of many potential weaknesses. First, it is a Marx who is aware of the dangers of climate change. On this reading, Marx was aware of the harm that capitalist methods were inflicting on nature. Marx was reading chemists who were demonstrating the negative effects on soil health. Marx was becoming conscious of the threat of capitalism to the earth. Second, it is a global Marx. On this reading, Marx was paying attention to countries outside industrialized Western Europe, to Russia and India, to South America, to indigenous peoples of North America. Marx was concerned about people other than the industrialized proletariat class. Third, it is a Marx who is open to alternative paths to communism. On this reading, Marx was considering alternatives to proletarian revolution. He was charting a path forward for rural, agrarian societies without going through Western-style industrialization. Fourth, it is a Marx who is no longer determinist. Insofar as he was charting these other paths forward, Marx was also revisiting the progress narrative of historical materialism and no longer wedded to determinism in history. Fifth, it is a Marx who embraces cooperatives and cooperation. Marx changes his views on collective ownership and forms of cooperative arrangements, especially with the case of the Russian communes. In this regard, there's a similarity between Marx and Lenin, Lenin changed his views at the end of his life, coming to favor cooperatives in his last his final essays on cooperation in 1923. And sixth, it is a Marx who is less fixated on violent armed revolution. As we saw in Marx 8:13, Engels already took a different view of armed struggle after 1849. On this reading, Marx was also forging a slightly different path forward, especially in the context of Russia. We can see all this clearly in the work of someone like Marcello Musto, who is very adamant on these points. Marcello Musto, a professor of sociological work of theory at York University in Canada, published this book in 2018 in Italian, L'ultimo Marx, 1881-1883, The Last Years of Karl Marx. The book appeared in English in 2020, and the book highlights the late Marx and proposes several turns in the later Marx that reorient our reading of Marx, Musto argues. He refers to these turns. He refers to several of these turns in his words. The first is an environmental and ecological emphasis. Musto writes, "Recent research has shown the importance Marx attached to the ecological question. On repeated occasions, he denounced the fact that expansion of the capitalist mode of production increased not only the thefts of workers' labor, but also the pillage of natural resources." A second turn is an emphasis on migration and immigration. Marx showed, he writes, that the forced movement of labor generated by capitalism was a major component of bourgeois exploitation, and that the key to fighting this was class solidarity among workers, regardless of their origins or any distinction between local and imported labor. Third, a turn to the global and to the anti- and post-colonial. Marx, Musto writes, undertook thorough investigations of societies outside Europe and expressed himself unambiguously against the ravages of colonialism. It is a mistake to think otherwise, Musto writes. Marx criticized thinkers who, while highlighting the destructive consequences of colonialism, used categories peculiar to the European context in their analysis of peripheral areas of the globe. Fourth, a shift towards cooperatives. As Musto writes, Marx went deeply into forms of collective ownership not controlled by the state. And then, as well, several turns, Musto emphasizes, turns towards individual freedom in the economic and political sphere, turns towards gender emancipation, towards the critique of nationalism, and, he writes, towards the emancipatory potential of technology. For Musto, the critical task is to displace attention from the early Marx, the young Marx, to the mature and late Marx. Musto is very explicit about this. He believes that the late Marx effectively repudiates the young Marx, not in the way in which Althusser proposed. This is not a philosophical versus scientific or economistic break. It is a break that takes us to a non-Eurocentric, post-colonial, environmentalist, and non-productivist Marx. Musto argues that the mature, the late Marx, supersede the early Marx. They displace what is less valuable work. Musto is explicit about this. The late Marx is far more precious, he says. He writes, this is what he writes, "For a long time, many Marxists foregrounded the writings of the young Marx, primarily the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 and the German ideology, while the Manifesto of the Communist Party remained his most widely read and quoted text. In those early writings, however, one finds many ideas that were superseded in his later work. It is above all in Capital and its preliminary drafts, as well as in the researches of his final years, that we find the most precious reflections. These represent the last, though not the definitive, conclusions at which Marx arrived." This is then, Musto is proposing a rehabilitated Marx, rehabilitated from the critiques to which he was subject, from feminists, from post-colonialists, from ecologists, etc. Musto is, if nothing else, defensive. Of Marx, he writes, quote, "He was anything but Eurocentric, economistic, or fixated only on class conflict." Though not all scholars of the late Marx are as defensive, and some of them try to do different work with the late Marx. So let's turn now to Kohei Saito's research and his book, Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto. Kohei Saito's book rests on several basic foundations. First and foremost, it's the urgency of the global climate crisis and the extent of the crisis we're facing. This is what grounds and motivates Saito's entire enterprise. Second, the fact that the global climate crisis is caused by capitalism. For Saito, the ecological crisis cannot be separated from a critique of capitalism. Saito describes the imperial mode of living in late capitalism that has brought us to the point of no return. It is a world of exploitation by the global north of the global south, and it is dooming all mankind. Third, the fact that most solutions that are being proposed today are simply insufficient and inadequate. The Green New Deal is counterproductive. Saito points out the paradox, for instance, that electric vehicles cause ecological harm because of the need for lithium for the batteries and the exploitative mining practices and destructive ecological mining practices in places like the south of Congo. Saito demonstrates that so many of the proposed solutions to global warming are actually counterproductive. Our own efforts at using recycled bags and composting have trivial effects. On Saito's view, reducing carbon dioxide emissions cannot be achieved while growing our economies. And so, Saito argues, the reduction of emissions can only be achieved through degrowth. Saito draws a 2x2 chart to capture four possible futures. The x-axis, the horizontal axis, is the level of equality and goes from the most egalitarian positions on the left to the most unequal positions on the right. The y-axis is the concentration of political power in the state, with state power at the top and anarchy at the bottom. That creates four cells in the 2x2 table, and he describes these four resulting cells as our possible futures, with climate fascism in the top right, a strong state with great inequality, climate barbarism at the bottom right, great inequality in an anarchistic state, climate Maoism in the top left, a strong state that enforces equality, or what he has in mind in the bottom left, degrowth communism. Now, Kohei Saito is really engaged in a double displacement in this book, Slow Down. He performs a double displacement. He criticizes forms of Marxism that do not take account of global climate change, and simultaneously criticizes forms of environmentalism that do not take account of Marxist critiques of capitalism. On this basis, Saito argues for the common, a space of shared democratic governance of the commons, as a form of degrowth communism aware of and addressing climate change. The double displacement is similar to Black Marxism or feminist Marxism. In both of those cases, there's also a critique of Marxism for not taking into account race or gender, and a critique of race or feminist theories that do not take into account a critique of capitalism. Degrowth communism has that same double edge. At one end, on the side of degrowth, Saito argues for a degrowth theory that must clarify its critical position against capitalism. At the other end, on the side of communism, Saito argues for an ecologically aware, democratic, egalitarian common that opposes itself to an undemocratic state socialism controlled by state bureaucrats, and focuses on the environment. The book opens with a sharp criticism of greenwashing, of all the different efforts to address global climate change within the framework of existing capitalist methods, a critique of sustainable development goals, SDGs, and of corporate ESG programs, a critique of carbon taxes. He calls all of these the opiate of the masses and critiques them as mere band-aids in the face of climate cataclysm. None of them are vigorous enough to combat increasing global temperatures. He builds on Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory to show how interconnected the world is, with the core economies dependent on and exploiting the periphery, and he rejects all models that have a growth component. In his book, he then explores the writings of Kate Raworth and her donut theory of degrowth economics, the idea of placing limits on growth in advanced industrialized countries, while allowing the economies of less developed countries to expand so that they achieve minimum standards of health and welfare. Here, too, Saito critiques Raworth for failing to take on the problems of capitalism. And so he argues for degrowth coupled with a critique of capitalism. He writes, quote, "Capitalism's dependence on externalization and displacement guarantees that it will always work against global justice," he writes. The heart of the matter for Saito is that retaining capitalism will never achieve equality and social justice because capitalism itself is, in his words, quote, "a system that always seeks to open up new markets to accumulate capital and increase value." Or as he writes a few lines later, the essence of capitalism is that it will never stop growing in order to create profit. Saito builds on theories of the common developed by Michael Hart, Tony Negri, and others, and he offers the common as a third way. Now, the translation in English uses the commons in the plural, which typically refers to older theories regarding, for instance, the tragedy of the commons or the shared common greens in the center of small New England towns. By contrast, the newer theories of the common use the term in the singular, so I'll try to keep the singular here, even if it doesn't roll off the tongue as easily. The idea of the common is to create communal property governed democratically by the people, by citizens with equal voice. Saito argues that Marx gradually came to embrace a theory of the common, understood as the shared management of citizens in a democratic, equal way, rather than leaving administration up to specialists, as advocated by the concept of social common capital. Now, in his earlier work, including the Communist Manifesto, Marx believed that capitalist growth and greater production would lead to crises of overproduction and ultimately to the downfall of capitalism and the emergence of socialism. This, of course, rested on a progress narrative based on the double-edged sword of productivism. Capital growth led both to exploitation and domination, but eventually to proletarian revolution and dictatorship. Saito argues, though, that Marx revises his theories as he witnessed the resilience of capitalism throughout the revolutions of 1848-49, throughout the crisis of 1857, and later throughout the rise and fall of the Paris Commune in 1871. Marx revises his assumptions, which he tried to present in Capital, but he only published Volume 1. The work, Capital, is unfinished, and the second and third volumes were distorted by Engels, according to Saito. As a result, we do not hear the real or authentic Marx in Volumes 2 and 3. Instead, we have two over-edited volumes in which Engels imposes his views on Marx. In order to properly decipher where Marx was headed in Capital, we must look at the last years of Marx's life, at what he was reading, the notes he was taking, and what preoccupied him. According to Saito, then, Marx shifted away from productivism after capitalism, But this was masked by Engels' editorial work. Saito writes, "The problem is that this major shift is difficult to detect in the version of capital currently in circulation. Engels sought to emphasize the systematic nature of capital and ended up concealing the parts of it that were unfinished. In other words, the parts of these volumes in which Marx grappled theoretically with its analysis were removed from view, as was the very evidence of this struggle. As a result, only the handful of researchers who have studied the research notes Marx kept at the end of his life are aware of this shift in his thinking. This means that even specialized scholars and committed Marxists labor under a misunderstanding of Marx's ultimate views." So, the misunderstandings caused by Engels' distortions, those misunderstandings are that Marx remained a productivist economist with a Eurocentric focus. But those which become then kind of criticisms of Marx are off target. Saito argues that the few writings that exist from the late period of Marx's life offer the best guide to where Marx was headed in Capital. These late readings, notes, and annotations open a window on Marx's ecological concerns. Saito points to a passage in Volume 3 of Capital, a sentence where Marx writes about the, quote, squandering of the vitality of the soil. Saito interprets this passage as Marx sounding the alarm about the problems of ecology. Saito argues that Marx saw and predicted the ecological harms, especially in Volume 3 of Capital, and especially based on his reading of the work of Liebig, Agricultural Chemistry. Saito writes, "Marx warns us in Capital that capitalism opens up an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism. This is the section touching on Liebig's work, as he analyzes how large landed property ownership underpins the business of agriculture under capitalism." He quotes this passage from Marx. "In this way, large-scale land ownership produces conditions that provoke an irreparable rift in the interdependent process between social metabolism and natural metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of the soil. The result of this is a squandering of the vitality of the soil, and trade carries this devastation far beyond the bounds of a single country." Saito writes of that passage from Marx, "Marx is sounding the alarm here, in the 3rd volume of Capital, that capitalism will undermine the conditions necessary for sustainable production by disrupting and opening up a rift in the metabolism connecting humans and nature. Capitalism makes the sustainable management of this metabolic connection impossible and thus hinders the further development of society." Now, in his earlier book from 2017, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Saito had highlighted that Marx had studied the overharvesting of forests, the waste of fossil fuels, the extinction of seeds, and that those were all arising from the contradictions of capitalism. Saito suggested back then that Marx was evolving towards an idea of a sustainable economic development within socialism, or what he called eco-socialism, but that Marx would eventually progress even further. In Slow Down, Saito goes further and argues that Marx embraced degrowth at the end of his life. That is Saito's main point in this book. It is that Marx changed his view of communism at the end of his life when he brought together his research in ecology with his research into communal land-owning societies. According to Saito, Marx's research in ecology was pointing to a civilizational collapse, and his work on communal forms of ownership was pointing to the solution of cooperatives and communes. Marx revises his view of capitalism, suggesting that productivism does not lead to communism, nor to emancipation from class struggle, but instead to the destruction of nature. This represents naturally a radically different way of thinking about capitalism as compared to the classic Marx interpretation. In fact, it's not clear what one would need to retain or could retain from the classic Marxian view of industrial production. It also entails a very different conception of history. As Saito notes, his reading of the late Marx demands that we reassess his earlier views on history as progress, given that capitalism now brings about not progress but the irreversible destruction of the natural environment and the devastation of society. This shakes the foundation of Marx's historical thinking. It is no longer evident that Western Europe, with its high level of industrialization and productivity, could be more advanced than the non-Western world. Saito argues that Marx actually came to favor the sustainable management of land through communal property in Capital, Volume 3, in a passage where Marx discusses ground rent and where Marx writes, "Instead of a conscious and rational treatment of the land as permanent communal property, as the inalienable condition for the existence and reproduction of the chain of human generations, we have the exploitation and the squandering of the powers of the earth." Now, all of this appears even more clearly, Saito argues, in a draft of Marx's letter to Vera Zasulich, where it becomes plain that, this is Saito writing, that that communal property of the Germanic peoples and the Mirs in Russia hold within them elements to which the modern societies in Western Europe must return. Actually, that is a passage from a draft of a letter, of Marx's letter to Vera Zasulich. On the basis of those draft letters, Saito argues that Marx changed the way he thought about communism in Western Europe. Now, of that, I'm not entirely convinced. I mean, clearly Marx was open to another path to communism in a country like Russia, which did not experience industrialization. But that did not necessarily change the path for Western Europe, I would say. I mean, he didn't include that passage in his final letter, and perhaps for a reason. The final letter is much more chastened, much more cautious than the drafts, and I think we need to pay attention to what is and is not included in the public letter. In any event, I'm not entirely convinced that it extends to his analysis of the West. By contrast, what he was surely suggesting is that in countries like India or Russia, there was the possibility of communal ownership and a steady-state economy that would ultimately lead to communism. Saito writes, Marx ends up asserting that it's precisely the steady state of a commune's economy that allows it not only to resist colonial domination, but also to hold within it the possibility of toppling the power of capital and achieving communism. And of that, I think he's right. Of course, Saito goes further, though, and his main point is that, as he writes, quote, "The communism envisaged by Marx late in his life was an egalitarian, sustainable form of degrowth economics." Saito makes clear that his unique contribution is to show that Marx went further than eco-socialism. He went further than the idea of a steady-state, sustainable economy, or even of a growth economy that is sustainable. He went so far as to embrace the idea of degrowth. And this is Saito writing. No one, though, went so far as to propose degrowth communism. No scholars of Marx, that is. Even in Karl Marx's eco-socialism, I stopped at noting how a call for sustainable economic development was part of Marx's eco-socialist thought. But the fact is, Saito wrote, Marx's change of mind after turning away from productivism and concentrating on searching for a revolutionary possibility in the study of non-Western and pre-capitalist communal societies is not just evidence that we should revise the way we imagine him. Rather, it is evidence that Marx reached the point of imagining degrowth communism as a project that might truly topple Western European capitalism. Saito's point is that Marx eventually came to embrace degrowth communism. The real theoretical shift in the late Marx, then, is degrowth. Now, based on that argument, Saito proposes 5 steps to promote degrowth communism today. The first is that society needs to shift its production and its attention from high-value goods to things that have high-use value. By high-value goods, Saito is referring to items that do not really address our needs in times of crisis. He's referring to value in the Marxist sense of commodity value, and to items like luxury goods that have high value in our society, but they have low use value. So basically he's proposing a shift in consumption and production that would focus on what we need in society to satisfy our most important needs. The second proposal is to shorten work hours and eliminate wasteful and unnecessary productivity, to get rid of marketing and advertising and packaging and consultancy and investment banking, to get rid of overnight shipping, to get rid of 24-hour stores. The idea would be to get rid of facets of the economy that are simply unnecessary to satisfying basic needs. This would allow us to reduce the number of hours that people work across society so that they could enjoy themselves more. And the only way that can be done, of course, is if there is degrowth or deceleration. The third proposal is to abolish the division of labor. The idea here is to eliminate specialization and uniformity in what we do. The idea is not to automate and augment creative activities outside work, but instead to make work itself more creative and attractive. The way to do that is to get rid of the specialization and standardization associated with the division of labor. As he writes, to make work attractive again, we must establish sites of production that allow workers to engage in a wide variety of tasks and activities. The fourth proposal is to democratize the production process. This could be achieved by giving workers democratic decision-making power over production and might involve the turn to worker cooperatives, communal management of the means of production, and a commons regime to replace intellectual property rights and monopoly platforms like the GAFAs, Google, Apple, Facebook, etc. The fifth suggestion is to prioritize labor-intensive, essential work. So here the idea is to move away from, rather than towards, automation and artificial intelligence. Labor-intensive work, or labor-intensive industries, are those that require human labor, for example, care work. That is the kind of work that we should be valuing in society. It is the kind of work that will decelerate the economy. In sum, Saito advocates for a shift from high-value to high-use value goods, reducing work hours, abolishing the division of labor, democratizing production, and prioritizing labor-intensive work as a way to address the climate crisis caused by capitalism. He emphasizes the insufficiency of current solutions like the Green New Deal and highlights the exploitative nature of modern capitalism, particularly the imperial mode of living. He proposes a return to more labor-intensive industries like care and a reinterpretation of Marx's later work to focus on ecology and communal property. Capitalism claims to produce abundance, but in fact, it only creates scarcity, Saito argues. It creates scarcity by enclosing the common and turning it into private property and forms of profit, which then restrict resources and who has access to them. By contrast, Saito proposes a return to and to reclaim the common in order to restore what he calls radical abundance. All of this, I think, is very sympathetic and aligned with the idea of worker cooperatives and mutuals and consumer co-ops and the idea of cooperism. Kohei Saito urges us to be optimistic about the possibility of change. Fundamental change only requires that a small minority of people rise up in protest. The figure, he says, is actually only 3.5%. As Saito writes, quote, "This is the number that Harvard political scientist Erica Chenoweth came up with in the course of her research into protest strategies as the percentage of a population that must rise up sincerely and nonviolently to bring about a major change to society." On my reading, that major change will take place by means of worker and consumer cooperatives. In his work, Saito argues primarily for worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives are what return the means of production to the common. Quote, workers' co-ops play a crucial role in workers regaining their autonomy and power of self-determination, he writes. Every member of a co-op invests in, owns, and operates the enterprise. It's the workers who have the agency to discuss and determine what sort of work will be done and how it will take place. Worker ownership and democratic self-governance at work are the keystone to achieving the abundance of the common. As I try to suggest in cooperation, but as Saito discusses, there's this long tradition of worker cooperatives and cooperative ownership that goes back to the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers in 1844, forward to the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque Country today. Now, by contrast to my argument, Saito aligns Marx with worker co-ops. He refers specifically to passages from volumes 20 and 22 of the Complete Works, where Marx describes worker cooperatives as a possible communism. Saito discusses that worker co-ops are becoming more popular, especially within the British Labour Party. He too ties worker co-ops to a solidarity economy. He writes that workers' cooperatives can become the basis by which to transform society overall, premised as they are on resisting the impoverishment, discrimination, and inequality fostered by capitalism. Saito leans into cooperatives, especially in the context of Barcelona and the movement in Barcelona towards the fearless city for the future. One of the things he notes about Barcelona is that it is in a particularly good position to clear a path forward because of its long tradition of worker cooperative there, the very same workers' co-ops that Marx called examples of possible communism, he writes. It is clear that Saito believes that cooperatives can pave the way to degrowth communism, and in this context, his work aligns well with the theory of cooperism. He writes, Spain has always been a hotbed of cooperative associations, and Barcelona is famous for its social solidarity economy, which includes not only worker cooperatives, but also consumer cooperatives, mutual aid societies, organic produce cooperatives, and so on. The social solidarity economy, in fact, employs about 53,000 people, or 8% of the people employed in the city, producing 7% of the city's total gross production. So, in the end, worker co-ops and cooperism are central to Kohei Saito's vision. And this is where slow down dialogues with cooperation, something that I hope we can explore at the seminar. Welcome to Marx 1113.